welcome to the S.O.A.P video series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. I'm Daniel, this is Gary, and we are starting a brand new series that we're going to take some time to get through. This is a long book. And so we're going to, sometimes we do a long book and we do it a little slowly, and that's what we're going to do. This is
perfectly paced.
Of course it is.
Yeah, so what book?
This is the book of Jeremiah.
Ooh, Jeremiah.
So, fun fact about Jeremiah is that this is one of the longest books of the Old Testament. Now, if all you're doing is looking at chapters, you're like, hold on a second, how is that possible? Jeremiah has 14 fewer chapters than Isaiah, but
more
actual
verses.
Words, verses, everything, it actually blows Isaiah away.
Nice.
If you combine Jeremiah and Lamentations, which is the other book he wrote, Jeremiah wrote more of the Old Testament than everybody except Moses.
Nice.
You get the first 5 books.
Moses,
So even more than the Psalms, even more than as far as any individual writer. So there's a lot of content that we're going to have to go through here in the book of Jeremiah.
Yeah, so the first thing is, who's Jeremiah? Where do we place him in a time frame?
Yeah.
So he was a priest.
Yep.
Right? But then he was also a prophet.
Yes.
Right? So, which is important.
Yeah.
And he seemed to start out very young.
Yeah.
In there. And in fact, he even says, my speech isn't so good.
Yeah, I'm not good. I'm not, God says, I've commissioned you to be a prophet. He's like, I'm not sure that's a good idea.
Yeah. And then God comes back with, I'll tell you what to say.
Yeah.
And, okay, but I'm kind of scared to go in here. I'll tell you where to go.
Yep.
And as long as you follow me, you'll be safe. So it doesn't say that nothing is bad is going to happen to him.
Right, because it will. There's a lot of stuff in here.
Right, exactly. But he does say you'll be safe.
Yeah.
And secure.
So on those lines, Jeremiah and Ezekiel actually are really interesting because it's not just thus saith the Lord. It's not just prophecy. There's a lot of personal stuff. Jeremiah's personal life that's in here. And God has him do some things that, and Ezekiel's the same way, that do some things in his personal life that are going to reflect and sort of explain, some of his prophecy. Okay. So that's interesting.
Okay.
He's not just a prophet to Israel. God specifically says, I'm going to make you a prophet to the nations. So there's a little bit of Paul in there, because Paul was an apostle to the nations. Right. So Jeremiah is not focused just on Israel. A lot of his prophecies...
Which is good, because... because of the time placement. Yeah. Right? So we are at the point in time where the nation of Israel has split into two. Right. And in fact, we were... because he was there for 43 years. Yeah. At some point, the northern nation has already been taken over by Syria. Has already been taken into
captivity, right.
Yeah. So now we're talking, we're just left with Jerusalem, which would have been, I can't think of the family, Jacob?
Judah.
I don't know why. Judah and Benjamin.
Yeah, so we've got basically the 2 southern tribes are all that's left. There are just a handful of kings left. And so Jeremiah's prophecy is going to be, Israel, this is what they did. You don't want to go down that path. Yeah. Which, of course, Judah did. And so then we have the captivities.
Right. And we find that in, we're covering, the first 3 chapters, first 3, right?
4.
First 4 today is all God saying, don't do that. Yeah. And Jeremiah saying, don't do that. And they're doing it. Right. Right. And they're continuing to do it, and they have continued to do it. Yep. And it's actually the end of it.
Yeah. So one of the things that we're going to be watching for, we're not going to look at every prophecy. We're going to read the whole book, but we're not going to look at every word and every detail. Right. One of the things that we will be looking for in Jeremiah is there are several places that there's like a famous verse. Okay. Yeah. And if you just pull it out of its context, sometimes people use it for all sorts of things. We're going to try to point those out in their context. You've heard this verse before, or maybe you've heard this before. Here's the context. Here's where you see it. Yep. And is it something that we can apply, or is it not something we should be applying here? So the other thing that we'll see is that it is not just all prophecy. There is historical narrative that is sprinkled throughout.
Right. So he, with 43 years, he's going through a number of kings, as you said. Right. During the end time.
Yeah. So we'll want to pay attention to some historical markers, because one of the things that we see, the book of Jeremiah is not chronological straight through.
Of course not.
Of course not. So there's going to be some skipping around.
Who would write a book in order?
So whenever one of these historical markers shows up, we'll try to point that out too.
Okay. Well, speaking of jumping around, so chapter 3, I love chapter 3 of Jeremiah. So it talks about divorce.
Yeah.
Right? And when we think about divorce is always in a negative light.
Yeah.
Always bad things. But in this connotation here, God divorces Israel.
Yeah.
How can that happen?
Well, because divorce itself is never called a sin. Okay, divorce is always a result of sin. There's always something in the background that pushes in that direction, or, somebody's sin may lead to divorce. But divorce itself is never called sin. God doesn't like it, and yet he says, listen, and this is really chapter 2 leading into chapter 3. What we're going to find in Jeremiah is the concept of spiritual adultery.
Right.
And he's going to use I'm just telling you right now, he's going to use some pretty...
heavy.
Sometimes heavy, crass almost language, some very picturesque language, to say this is what you've been doing.
Right.
But
that's the point he's at.
Right.
I mean, it's been hundreds, if not more than that, of years where come back to me. So,
he's going to tell him, just one example, just to give you one example, because this leads into the divorce conversation. He's like, you guys flirt with so many other gods, you could teach prostitutes a thing or two. So there's a little bit of sarcasm in there, but definitely this God is a jealous God, and we see that throughout Jeremiah.
Yeah, definitely. So the sin would be adultery.
Adultery, right. And now, the thing is both literal and figurative.
Yeah. So did the nation of Israel marry another god?
No.
Right.
Yeah. And in fact, in chapter 2, he says, people, you don't know, this is unheard of in the history of the world, any nation trading one god for another. So you may flirt with other gods, you may involve other gods, but they never completely replaced the true and living God. In fact, one of his arguments, or one of his accusations, is you go play with them and then you get in trouble and you always come back to me.
Yes. That's exactly what we do.
So he said, fine, you want to go? There's your bill of divorce. There's your papers. Go. And so they did, but they never married, we're air quotes, right? They never married another god. And because of that, under the law, had they married another god, under the law, if a woman was divorced and she married another man, she could never go back to her ex.
Right.
But Israel is going to return to God.
Right.
How can they do that? Because they've never officially gone with another religion or another god. Right. They've always claimed they were.
So from a time standpoint, we have the northern kingdom is gone. We just have the southern kingdom. The quote divorce happens.
Yep.
Nebuchadnezzar comes in, wipes them out. Either killed and takes away a remnant to Babylon, which then becomes Persia at that point. And then after Cyrus allows them to come back 70 years later.
Yeah.
So after they come back, after they rebuild the temple, after they do the dedication, that would be the remarriage part?
Not really. No, because the remarriage the language is always in a future fulfillment.
So not even yet?
Not even yet. The Messianic kingdom, the millennium.
Oh, okay.
So he uses, so marriage is a covenant, right? And so he uses covenant language. Old covenant, new covenant. It's in Jeremiah that we find the major passage about the new covenant, and all that stuff is talking about the millennial kingdom.
Oh, okay.
So no, officially they haven't been remarried yet. Israel is still away from God. They have not turned to God yet as a nation. That won't happen until during the 70th week of Daniel, the tribulation. At the end of that, he'll come back, and then they'll have basically that remarriage in the kingdom. Yeah.
Okay. Good to know.
So when you're reading through this, a lot of this language is switching back and forth between this is what you're doing now, but in the future I will. And that hasn't happened yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. So there's a lot of other stuff going on in here too, but I just wanted to specifically bring out that chapter 3 because to me that is one of the more interesting pieces that you don't hear a lot of times in church, that God divorced Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. It's there. God divorced Israel. God divorced Judah. And if you have questions about that, there's a lot of stuff. We can definitely talk about that if you have questions. But it's in there, right? It's in there. Yeah. Now, the number one sin, there's lots of sins, but the number one sin, if there were one that we could point to and say, okay, that's the cause for the exiles, it's idolatry, worshiping false gods. And so we get to chapter 4, and God says, if you want to come back to me, you have to get rid of those disgusting idols. That's the thing. Get rid of your idolatry, confess, and come back to me. Technically, after their exile, they've never worshipped other gods like they did.
Right.
Okay, they learned that lesson. But as a nation, they are still chasing everything else except for the true and living God. And they haven't come back to him yet as a nation. Individual Jewish people are definitely believing in Jesus as Messiah. They're saved. They're part of the church. But as a nation, they haven't. Right. So that's why we haven't seen that remarriage yet. Okay. But that's going to be this recurring theme throughout the book of Jeremiah. We'll spend some time on it. Again, we won't look at every individual prophecy. We're going to be trying to hit the highlights. And you can see this constant call that God is placing on them through Jeremiah.
Right, definitely.
So the other thing that you'll see is, at least in chapter 4, you'll see sometimes Jeremiah is speaking for God, sometimes he's speaking for himself. His response, not the nation's response, but Jeremiah's response to this new information, especially as a young guy. Yeah. God, it's sort of like Habakkuk. How could you do that? You have to trust me, but you get Jeremiah's response in here. See, I thought this, and wow, I wondered that, and how could this be? So it's a really interesting play through this book.
Yeah, good.
And if you haven't read it for a while,
exactly.
It's definitely going to be interesting. So,
all right, well, good.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place, a good intro to the book. Just get us going here, and next time we'll come back, we'll be a few more chapters in, and we'll just hit some of these highlights. If you have any questions, especially divorce or some of those types of things, verses that we're going to come across, bring those up. We'd be happy to answer those for you. Until then, we'll see you next time.
Bye, everybody.